Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book to screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. This week, I am going to be diving back into another Q&A with some fan questions that people have sent over to me to answer. So I'm excited to dive back into that. I know a lot of people love this type of podcast episode where we talk about questions that people are submitting over to me. And once again, thank you so much for sending them over. I think this week it's appropriate that we talk about some season 2 specific questions, given that they are officially filming. And I will preface by saying that I will probably be talking about some of that and discussing what it could mean in terms of season 2 and what it looks like. So if you're someone who is actively avoiding discourse about what we can confirm or lay eyeballs on in terms of season 2 rather than speculative conversation about it, just be warned that I will probably touch on that at some point in this episode. And I'll do another warning before and probably in the description mark when I start talking about it, just so if you want to avoid that specific part, we can, allow you to skip over it if you would like. But this week, like I said, I'm going to be talking about some season 2 specific questions. I have so many to go through, but I kind of pulled out the ones that I think are applicable to the casting news that we received this week. So hopefully you enjoy this podcast episode. I'm looking forward to sitting down and talking about it. We will be talking all about my speculation, so to speak, for what we might see in season 2, and that will be based on direct from the book facts that we know and how I think they could be adapted. So if you haven't read the book, you've been warned. If you're looking to avoid spoilers, you've been warned. And if you're still here, I thank you for listening to this episode. So one thing I've been debating, and you guys can let me know in the comments how you feel about this, but now that we're entering into season 2 and 3, and we are introducing so many new characters that overlap with the story of Shane and Ilya, I think it's important for anyone who hasn't read the books, or even if you have, to get a better idea of the timeline, because there's so many overlapping stories that we are going to be covering, especially now that we have confirmation that we cast Ryan and Fabian's characters, because their story actually takes place in that liminal time between the end of Heated Rivalry and the beginning of the long game, and then overlaps with them briefly in the long game as well. So if you haven't read that book, you might be a little confused as to how Ryan and Fabian in particular might show up in season 2 if season 2 is theoretically covering the story of the long game. And to me, I've always hoped and felt like you really can't cover the long game without that liminal space being addressed as well, because a lot happens, quote unquote, off screen in the stories. And without it, I don't think that the long game hits as hard. And especially in a narrative for TV and film, you want to make sure that you give the viewer all the context you can, especially if you're banking on the fact that maybe some of the people watching the show have not read the books. And since the show gained so much popularity, I would argue that a lot of the fans of the show have not read the books yet or do not want to leading up to season 2. So again, any context clues that can be provided are definitely going to be introduced, while also maintaining the very obvious bar that has been set where Jacob assumes that his viewers are smart and can figure out what's going on without him having to quite literally spell it out for them. So the first question I got was, I've seen many fans on social media saying they would like the long game and role model to be adapted into 2 seasons instead of just 1. Do you think it's possible to tell this story well without including the events from the end of the book in the 2nd season? I personally think it would be strange not to see Troy's Pride Night or Shane and Ilya's second wedding as the season finale, but what is your opinion? So when I was sitting down thinking about how I wanted to answer this question, I thought that it was probably important to first map out some key timeline points for Troy's character specifically, just so that you understand where the overlap for him is probably going to start, because a lot of people, I think, are assuming that they're just going to cover the events of Troy in the self-contained role model book, but Troy's story actually starts much sooner than that and is coinciding with the events of Tough Guy and that liminal space between the end of Heated Rivalry and the beginning of the long game. And I definitely know that Jacob's going to include it, because you can't have a narrative arc for Troy without the backstory being part of this. So Troy in particular is a character, and again, if you've read the books, you probably know this, but for those who haven't, he was drafted in 2013 to Toronto and moved to Toronto, ends up becoming friends with Dallas Kent. They are definitely kind of two peas in a pod at the beginning. He gravitated towards Dallas because Dallas sort of was this pseudo father figure to him when they were rookies together. And as we will learn, Troy has a father wound, big time. And that's touched upon in the long game as well. Troy and Dallas were roommates. They definitely were very close, and Troy just assimilated to the culture that Dallas bought into as well. There was always controversy around Dallas, and Troy just had this blind faith that Dallas had never been guilty of anything he was accused of. Eventually, he becomes an all-star by playing on a line with Dallas, and at the time that we meet Troy, I think he had been really, really isolating himself and patting himself from the emotions he didn't want to confront within himself, obviously being gay. But then in 2017, his father leaves his mother for a younger woman who he ends up marrying. And that divorce was really messy for him. And Troy, I think, was really deeply affected by that, ends up trying to become close with his mom and protective of his mom. There's a lot of discourse between him and his father, and he sends his mom on this worldwide traveling excursion so that she can kind of start to heal herself. And around that time in 2018 is when Ryan Price joins Toronto's team. So again, that's where the overlap between those two characters is really significant, because this is happening the year after where we end season 1. So Ryan joins Toronto. Troy and Dallas are bullying him. We get a lot of conversation where they are making homophobic jokes, and the team kind of rallies behind that. Nobody stands up for Ryan in particular, and we know that in his book, he's struggling with his own sexuality as well. He's very much a recluse. Ilya mentioned that in season 1, that he kind of keeps to himself, struggles to make friends. In his book, we learn why that is. And around that time in 2018, that's when Shane and Ilya announced the Arena Foundation. They being Dallas and Troy, make a joke about Shane. And in response to that, Ryan is the one who stands up to them, tells his team that he himself is gay, makes a really big statement about that in the locker room, which is then supported by Wyatt Hayes, another character that we know has been cast already for season 2. And Troy is very moved by that. And that's a really important point in his storyline that they have to cover, because it becomes relevant to his character arc that we see in his book and where we will meet him theoretically in the long game. So Troy, after that moment, it's almost like a veil's been lifted. He starts to recognize how toxic Dallas's behavior is. He finds Ryan being able to admit that to the team very brave, and he feels guilty that he hasn't been a better teammate to him, because he's in the same position as Ryan, and he's potentially made his situation worse by associating with Dallas, and he's trying to then right the wrong of that. At the same time, in 2018, he starts secretly dating a man who is an actor in Vancouver. That character's name is Adrian De La Cruz. I don't know if they're going to feature him in the show or just make mention of him. And the two of them are both hiding this big secret. And that's something that starts to eat away at Troy. And when he's living in Toronto playing on this team, it's also long distance, which is something he struggles with. But he, like Shane, is constantly living in fear that he will be discovered and struggles with going such long periods without seeing his boyfriend. There's just a fundamental breakdown between who he is as he starts to fall in love with this man and who he's presenting as while on this team in Toronto. And at a certain point, they break up and Troy's devastated. Then when we head into 2019, Troy was supposed to participate in the All-Star game. He ends up getting hurt and not participating in it. Then his first All-Star weekend ends up being in 2020. That is around the time that we start the long game. He ends up talking to Scott Hunter, and Troy, again, is struggling deeply with his own sexuality. This is when he starts to mingle with some of the other characters in this Heated Rivalry universe. In November of that year, him and his boyfriend break up. He finds out that he had cheated on Troy with another person in the film industry. Troy, being heartbroken, can't talk to anybody about it because he doesn't have anyone in his community. And then a couple of days later, after that, is when Dallas Kent is accused of assault, sexual assault, and Troy ends up reading it for the first time, believing it because he's no longer buying into Dallas's lies anymore. Even though he wasn't a witness, he knows in his heart of hearts that it's true, given his history of how he speaks about women. And that is when Troy starts to push back against that narrative. And all of this is happening while his ex-boyfriend is announcing that he's engaged to another man. So Troy is in a really dark place when all of this is happening, and he snaps during practice when Dallas starts making jokes at people. He outright accuses him in front of his team, and that confrontation was secretly recorded, dumped onto the internet, and very quickly Troy is traded from Toronto to Ottawa for a few draft picks, which is essentially saying they just really wanted to get rid of him. He wasn't worth enough for them to bother trading for anything else. And it reinforces that instead of dealing with the problematic behavior, they just get rid of anyone who calls out the problematic behavior. So Troy gets shipped off to Ottawa. We meet him in the long game when he arrives in Ottawa, and he's on the tail end of this really pivotal moment in his life where he just now starts to stand up to Dallas. He just now starts to voice his opinions. He just now starts to realize that the way he's been conducting himself has not been positive or healthy. And so his emotions are all over the place when he arrives in Ottawa. And I think he once again is assuming the worst when he gets there. And he is following Wyatt Hayes, who was also traded in and amongst the timeline of this to Ottawa himself. So that's another character that will follow all of these side characters through that liminal space in 2018, 2019, 2020, and interweaves all of these storylines together. So all of that, I think, is important to have as context when we're talking about Troy's storyline in particular, and why you have to include that, because a lot of what happens will inform Ilya's behavior because Troy and him become close to one another, and you can't have the payoff of him coming out or him coming out to the world during Pride Night with Harris if you don't have the backstory of where he's coming from. The other element of that is that all of that backstory is taking place in that 2017, 2018, 2019 time where Shane and Ilya largely have things happening off screen. And we are ending season 1 in 2017 in the summertime. It's July, I believe, when they're at the cottage. And so you can weave in the end of Heated Rivalry in and amongst the events of Tough Guy, which features Ryan Price, That's all interwoven naturally with Troy's story as well. It introduces Wyatt in that time period as well. And so I do think that you can't start season 2 without filling in that 2+ years of time to introduce all these characters, give a proper beginning, middle, and end for those character arcs, and then also be able to see what Shane and Ilya's relationship was like in those early stages when they decide to commit to one another. Because if you don't have that context, then by the time we are in the time period of the long game, which starts in 2020, and they're going through their relationship struggles that they're going through, you don't see where they started and where they are. You don't see how things compounded for Ilya in particular, but also for Shane. You don't see how they struggle with this new dynamic between them when they are committed to one another, but still struggling with the distance, still struggling with their teams. And all the while, there are other important timeline events happening in and around them. So by the time we get to 2020, everything sort of clashes together at the perfect time. So I definitely think that you have to include that liminal space. I think you have to include the events from the end of the book in the second season. And one of the most important parts of the end of the book that we haven't seen is the immediate aftermath of the dinner with Shane's parents and how Ilya and Shane go back to Shane's cottage. They end up having a drink together out on the deck. And the disparity between where the two of them are at mentally is something that really is the bedrock and the foundation of what we will see play out between them in the long game. So you do need to include this in some capacity. And whether or not they adapt this particular scene one for one or take the sentimentality of it and rework it into another moment, I'm okay with either option. But as a refresher, when they go back to the cottage, Shane can't concentrate. He's jittery, he's distracted, and he tells Ilya, "This has been the weirdest day of my life." And Ilya transversely looks at him and says it's the best day of his life, even though it was awkward, because this is something he never thought that he would have. He never thought that he would be welcomed into another family because he had barely been welcomed into his own family. He never thought that he would feel this close to home. He never thought that he would be able to openly tell Shane that he loves him whenever and however frequently he wanted to. And he cannot reconcile the fact that his life has changed so drastically in a matter of hours. And with that, you can see that Shane hasn't mentally caught up to that yet. He's not living in the emotional space. He's still living in that logistical space. And he says as much. I keep thinking about logistics. The earliest you could be in Ottawa would be the season after next when your contract is done with Boston, right? Ilya doesn't want to talk about those things. He just wants to enjoy the fact that someone else knows about them and they're in love and they're actually going to do this together. So whether or not you have this particular conversation or, again, you rework it into another conversation of some sort, you have to draw that line to show that Shane is living in the practical side of things still. He is thinking about logistics. He is thinking about the timeline. He is thinking about how long it will be before Ilya can move to Ottawa, and then what that means when he moves to Ottawa, because they have to become friends first publicly, and then they have to start the charity, and then they have to XYZ. Whereas Ilya just wants to exist in this happy bubble that they've walked into after finally admitting that they love each other. So again, that disparity is really important heading into the events of the long game. So to answer this question in a very roundabout way, yes, I do think that with the amount of content we have to get through and the fact that we still have to cover what happens at the end of Heated Rivalry, I do think seasons 2 and 3 will be covering both the events of the end of 2017, the summer of 2018, some filler for the characters on the peripheral like Ryan and Troy and Wyatt for 2018, 2019, before we get into the meat and potatoes of the long game in 2020 and 2021. And then if we were to get a season 4, that would probably cover as much of Unrivaled as they can. I have no idea how long they want to put the show out for. I have no idea how long the actors want to commit to these characters for. So if they are trying to fit everything into 3 seasons, which again, I personally don't think they will, then they will do what they did in season 1, which is condense a lot of those scenes down to 2 or 3 minute total length scenes and push the timeline along in a much more sufficient way rather than spend 15 minutes going through some of these character arc moments or scenes in particular. And that, I think, leads naturally into the next question that I received, which is, how do I think they will split the season? And how will the rumored 2-hour special play into it? This person wanted me to kind of dive into how they could theoretically use a 2-hour special that I think there's been rumblings about to supplement seasons 2 and 3, and then how that would change the structure of seasons 2 and 3. Obviously, we don't have confirmation of this, so this is all hypothetical, but let's talk about it because I do have some opinions on that. If we are to get a 2-hour special, I think the one thing that would make sense to include there is the My Dinner with Hayden scene, Shane coming out to his team, Hayden finding out about them, and then the announcement of the Arena Foundation. All of that you could put into a 2-hour special if the 2-hour special is entirely focused on Shane and Ilya. If the 2-hour special is going to be something that feels like sort of a movie of sorts, then that would mean that we are going to break out of the stereotypical shooting structure of the show where we're either in Shane's POV or Ilya's point of view and expand it so that we include these other side characters. And then theoretically, all of this content that I just laid out that takes place at the end of 2017, the year of 2018, and the year of 2019, that includes Ryan's storyline and Troy's introduction, and also all of the events that happen to Shane and Ilya before Ilya ends up in Ottawa. You could theoretically fit that all into a 2-hour special. It would just be like a mini movie. I don't know how plausible that is, but one can dream. I've also heard rumblings that they might do a Christmas special. More than likely, that would just be like an episode length. So that would be an hour, not 2 hours. And I would really, really hope that they use that hour to do the My Dinner with Hayden scene, because I think that that's a scene that needs room to breathe. It is very important in setting up the payoff at the end or close to the end of the long game with Hayden, and having him be the one that leaks that photo by accident or the video by accident. And you really can't get that payoff if you don't establish early on what the dynamic is between Ilya and Hayden, because that's a really big point of contention for Shane in particular. And that scene is very impactful. And I also think it's really cool to use that scene as a bonus episode of sorts, because it was a bonus piece of material that Rachel included on her website. So that parallel, I think, would be appropriate if they covered that as a special and then filmed everything else in tandem with a typical season of cumulative episodes. I do think that if they go the first route where it's 2 hours long and they include events from Ryan Price's storyline and Troy Barrett's storyline, most of it would probably have to dive into those two characters far more. And maybe that would be a way to sort of, I don't want to say satisfy everyone, because I don't think Jacob's out to do that necessarily, but I think a lot of people are worried that these other characters are going to take up too much screen time, which to me is a funny sentiment because they're important to the story. So I'd rather have them show up a little bit more if it helps push the storyline along than hide them necessarily. But you could contain them all to this bonus episode, have all of that context heading into season 2 about these characters. And that way, season 2 can be fully dedicated to Shane and Ilya, and these side characters of Ryan and Troy and Fabian and Harris can just pop in and out less frequently, but we already know what the deal is with them. And so their storylines being put in the background more would feel a little bit more seamless in that way, because in that 2-hour special, we got their lore drops, essentially. We know what happened to them. We know when it happened to them. We have more context about them as people. We have more context about their dating histories and what their experience with professional hockey has been like, what their experience with their sexuality has been like. And that all would aid in season 2 being able to cover them less, quote unquote, and follow Shane and Ilya more. And I think that might be a way to, again, include all of the information we need without it taking up screen time in the actual second season or third season. The next question I got was, what possible minor changes to the scripts do you think that we will see? And I could go on and on and on about this question, I think, which is dangerous because there's just too many things I want to cover. But what I want to start with is based on the images that came out from the set this week. So again, if you're looking to avoid spoilers for the actual set and what the characters are probably going to be up to and what we think they're filming, then this would be the part where I would take a moment and skip maybe. But this week, the internet was graced with images of Connor Story playing Ilya, and also Hudson and Connor both filming a scene as Shane and Ilya. And there is a little bit of context in each of those leaked photos that we can draw. And the first image that we got of Connor as Ilya, he is standing in front of a funeral home and he is in an all-black outfit. And I hoped and prayed and wished and dreamed that we would get this scene where Ilya attends the funeral of Duncan Harvey, who was another instigator in the league that Ryan Price in particular dealt with himself as an instigator as well. And there's a really important storyline there about mental health in particular and how it's not treated properly by the league and those people don't get the support they need. And it's also a really pivotal moment between Ilya and Ryan because that's the first time he invites Ryan to be a coach at the Game Changers camps alongside him and Shane. And we get that really important conversation between the two of them where the characters cross over in a way they hadn't previously, and that takes place in the 2018 timeline. So I am deeply optimistic that we will get a good chunk of time spent on that scene and between Ryan and Ilya. And I think that, again, that aids in Ilya's storyline and the long game to have context that in that liminal space, he is still thinking about mental health. It is a priority to him. They start the Arena Foundation. Ryan watches them start the Arena Foundation, so he knows that Ilya feels strongly about mental health initiatives and then puts his money where his mouth is when he shows up to this funeral of Duncan Harvey when no other players really bothered to show up for him in that way. And I am really excited for that scene because they have a conversation after the funeral, and that's when Ilya confronts Ryan about how hockey makes him feel and that if it doesn't make him happy, then maybe he needs to take a good hard look at that and change his life and do things that do make him happy because they just lost someone to a really tough mental health battle. And Ilya knows how important it is to address it. And then the crux of all of that is that Ilya doesn't address his own. And that's a really important aspect of his story that I think needs to be flushed out fully, and this scene is the perfect opportunity to do so. It also gives Jacob an opportunity to write an original scene in and around the events of this funeral, and we can also see what happens with Shane when he's at the All-Star weekend without Ilya and fill in some context there, because I think a lot of people are worried about what Shane is going to do for most of the season while Ilya is dealing with his mental health struggles because we don't see a lot of what Shane's up to. And I hope and think that Jacob is going to lean into his dynamics with his team, because he comes out to his team and we don't see that in the book. It's happening off screen. He has Hayden find out about him and Ilya in that timeline in 2018. We see him struggling with wanting to introduce his boyfriend to people that matter to him and have Hayden and Ilya get along in that 2018 time period during the My Dinner with Hayden scene. We also know that he wins another Stanley Cup, and that's a really important journey to follow him on because it's brushed over in the book as well. So I think Jacob's going to fill that timeline with more interactions between Shane and his team to showcase just how little support Shane has around him. And it will be in direct contrast to the locker room in Ottawa, where Ilya has much more support around him. And that's really important to cover. So I am not worried about what Shane's going to be up to. I think most of our scenes with him are going to involve his team and his locker room, so that when he leaves and they fail him by the end of the long game, it hits harder because you can fully see the disparity between those two clubs, and that Shane, as a leader and captain of that team, was wronged by the behavior that he received and the lack of support that he gets in that locker room. So in terms of the changes to the script, it's less of a change, more of an addition. I think that there's a lot of blanks that will be filled with original scenes. I think that there's going to be scripts that condense timelines, but also elongate some of the ones that aren't necessarily covered in the book, so that, again, we see more of what Shane's doing on screen when he is with his team, because much of the long game we see Ilya alone, and I think we will probably get an equal amount of attention paid to Shane when he's alone with his team. And that is an effective way to convey the overarching message of the long game, which is that neither of them are wrong in how they're approaching their relationship. I think a lot of people assume that the way Shane handles things is maybe insensitive, or he's actively avoiding what's going on, or he's oblivious to it. And a lot of that, yes, you do have to take into consideration that he is autistic, but Ilya does not communicate to him, and he is an unreliable narrator in that book. And people miss that fact quite often, I think, when they're talking about the events of the long game. They give Ilya and his anger and his reactions to things so much weight, when in reality he is depressed. And depression can create a lot of unreliable narration in your own life and in your own head. And it's no different in this story. His reactions to things are clouded by that depression. And until he learns that he has the depression, admits that he has the depression, and then approaches it differently and is willing to confront it, he is reactionary and he is looking at things from a very warped perspective. Shane is only able to react with the information he receives. Much of that information is not reliable, again, because Ilya is not being truthful with him. And he already struggles with social cues and interpreting what people's meanings are behind their words and actions. So it's unfair to pit them against one another, because at the end of the day, the villain of this story is not how the two of them communicate with one another. It's the environment that they're in and the toxicity of the environment that they're in, and how the environment that they're in is forcing all of these conversations to take place, when in reality, if things were less toxic, then they'd be in a very different situation with one another. They wouldn't have to hide. It would just be a different world for the two of them to exist in. So I always like to throw that in as a reminder to people that they're not to be villainized. The villain is the league and the culture, and that's important to keep at the forefront of our minds. So I think the scripts will do a better job of outwardly expressing that villain as the culture, because in the book, the unreliable narration, it might not translate as clearly on screen if we're just watching Ilya not say things to Shane. We can't have those inner thoughts on screen without a way to
have an outlet for him to express them. So I think that the scripts might introduce some scenarios where they can introduce the dialogue to support those inner thoughts, or they'll introduce story beats that will properly showcase just what they're afraid of, because they're afraid of the repercussions of being discovered. We need to see what the repercussion might look like, because right now we don't really have that context. So I do think that those types of changes will probably show up in season 2 and 3 to better articulate those fears that the two characters have, especially now that they're together. The last question, which this should be a quick one to answer. Someone asked me, how will Jacob deal with COVID in the long game? And again, if you haven't read the books, you wouldn't know this, but there is a call out in the book that explains that COVID does not happen in this universe. So Jacob doesn't have to worry about COVID in the long game. And thank God, because that would have been a very interesting thing to talk about if we had to accommodate that in the story. But no, it's not a thing in this universe. It's not going to have to be brought up. It's not going to have to be addressed. So that's a non-factor. I'm more worried about how they're going to pull all of these many overarching stories together, because they have a lot more overlap to deal with for season 2 and 3 than season 1, which is entirely self-contained. And then the secondary book that they covered for Scott and Kip was also self-contained within an episode, with very slight crossover in the other episodes where Scott appears. They have to be more involved, they being the secondary characters. They have to be more involved in the long game storyline, because they directly impact the plot. And I'm really excited to get a lot of scenes in particular that take place with these side characters, especially now that we got the announcement of Ryan and Fabian this week. I think the club scene with Shane and Ilya at the beginning of the long game is one of my favorites. It's also another really pivotal one to showcase what I was talking about earlier, which is the disconnect between where Ilya is mentally thinking about their relationship, and then where Shane is mentally when thinking about their relationship, and how that disconnect not being verbalized is going to cause some issues for both of them, and how they have to figure out how to navigate that. So that's another great scene that I'm looking forward to them including. And yeah, there's so much to talk about. Like I said at the top of the episode, I think it might be helpful to do an episode where I talk about the timeline of the show and how all of the books overlap in the greater sequence of events. So if that's something you're interested in, let me know in the comments or in my DMs. I think I'm probably going to record it anyway, just because I think it's important for people to have that context leading up to season 2. And at least then it's recorded somewhere for people to listen. And yeah, I have so many other questions on this Q&A list that we will cover, but I felt like these ones went together well, especially considering the photo leaks that we got from set this week. So hopefully you're all feeling pretty optimistic about what we're going to get, given the cast announcements that we received. And I'm excited. I think every day I wake up and am amazed that they turned this around so quickly and are already filming for season 2. It's unheard of how quickly they've done that. So I'll take any little morsel we can get, and I will enjoy it. And I can't believe that we're going to get more of these two characters on our screen so soon. As always, if you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you being here. I really appreciate everyone who sends in a message or talks with me in my DMs about the show, and continue to send them over. We have lots to discuss. I am really excited about some of these questions I got in my DMs, and some of them are going to be much more juicy deep dives into plot points for the long game. So keep them coming. Thank you again for making it all the way. This was a longer episode, and I will talk to you all in our next chat.